In October of 1962, the world stood closer to total annihilation than at any other moment in human history. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a 13-day confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, brought civilization to the razor's edge of nuclear war. In our reality, cooler heads prevailed, but what if they hadn't? What if a single miscommunication, a nervous trigger finger, or an act of political desperation had pushed both superpowers past the point of no return? This is the story of a world where the missiles flew, where the unthinkable became reality, and where humanity was forced to confront the full horror of its most terrible invention. It began, as it did in our timeline, with the discovery. American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft captured high-altitude photographs over Cuba, revealing what intelligence analysts had feared: Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles being installed on the island, just 90 miles from the Florida coast. These weapons could reach Washington, New York, and most major American cities within minutes. The photographs were brought to President Kennedy's desk on October 16th, and the world would never be the same. In the Situation Room beneath the White House, a group of advisors known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council gathered to debate the American response. Hawks pushed for immediate airstrikes against the missile sites. Doves argued for diplomatic channels. Kennedy chose a middle path, a naval blockade he called a quarantine around Cuba, giving the Soviets a chance to back down. But in this alternate timeline, that chance would never come. As American warships formed their blockade line across the Caribbean, Soviet submarines lurked beneath the waves. One submarine captain, under extreme pressure and out of communication with Moscow, believed war had already begun. Depth charges from American destroyers shook his vessel, and in the chaos and confusion, the order was given. A nuclear-tipped torpedo was armed and prepared for launch against the American fleet. In our world, a single Soviet officer named Vasily Arkhipov vetoed this launch. But here, no such veto came. The torpedo struck an American destroyer, and the first nuclear detonation of the conflict vaporized the ship and everything within a mile radius. The flash was visible from the Cuban coast. Within minutes, the chain reaction of escalation became unstoppable. American forces, confirming a nuclear attack on their fleet, immediately authorized retaliatory strikes against Soviet military positions in Cuba. Tactical nuclear weapons reduced the missile sites, the airfields, and the surrounding areas to scorched earth. Soviet military commanders in Cuba, believing a full-scale invasion was underway, launched every missile that was already operational. Two warheads arced northward toward the American mainland. One struck a military installation in the southeastern United States. The other detonated above a major coastal population center. The moment those warheads detonated on American soil, the full machinery of mutually assured destruction engaged. Deep beneath the Great Plains, missile launch officers received authenticated orders and turned their keys simultaneously. Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles roared out of their silos, their white exhaust trails cutting across the darkening American sky. Strategic Air Command bombers, already airborne on alert status, turned toward their predetermined Soviet targets. Across the Atlantic, American ballistic missile submarines surfaced just long enough to unleash their payloads. The apocalypse had a timetable, and it was measured in minutes. Soviet early warning radar detected the incoming American strikes, and the Kremlin's response was immediate and total. Every available intercontinental ballistic missile was launched toward North America. Soviet submarine commanders in the Atlantic and Pacific fired their nuclear missiles from beneath the ocean surface. The entire northern hemisphere became crisscrossed with ballistic trajectories, hundreds of warheads arcing through the upper atmosphere on parabolic paths toward targets that would cease to exist upon their arrival. The detonations came in waves. Washington was among the first American targets, a massive warhead detonating at optimal altitude above the city, generating a fireball miles across that vaporized the Capitol, the White House, the Key, Pentagon, and everything within the blast radius. The shockwave radiated outward at the speed of sound, flattening buildings, snapping trees, and hurling debris for dozens of miles in every direction. New York followed within seconds, then Chicago, Los Angeles, and every major military installation and industrial center across the continent. The same devastating pattern repeated itself across the Soviet Union as American warheads struck Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and hundreds of military and industrial targets stretching from Eastern Europe to Siberia. In the first hour, an estimated 400 million people perished. That number is almost impossible to comprehend. Entire cities were erased, their populations gone in the time it takes to draw a single breath. The destruction was not limited to the two superpowers. American military bases in Europe, Britain, and Turkey were struck by Soviet warheads, killing millions more. Radiation knew no borders and respected no neutrality. For those who survived the initial exchange, the nightmare was only beginning. The electromagnetic pulses from hundreds of nuclear detonations destroyed electrical grids across entire continents. Communications collapsed. Transportation networks ceased to function. Hospitals, already overwhelmed by casualties beyond any scale of medical preparedness, lost power and running water. In the fallout shelters, families huddled together listening to emergency broadcasts that grew weaker and less frequent. As transmitters went dark one by one, the radioactive fallout began descending within hours of the detonations. Carried by winds across thousands of miles, invisible particles of lethal contamination settled over farmland, water supplies, and surviving communities that had escaped the direct strikes. People who emerged from shelters found the world covered in a fine gray ash that poisoned everything it touched. Without proper detection equipment, millions unwittingly exposed themselves to radiation levels that would prove fatal within weeks. Then came the phenomenon that scientists had theorized but no one had truly prepared for: nuclear winter. The hundreds of nuclear detonations had lofted millions of tons of soot, ash, and debris into the upper atmosphere. This dark canopy began spreading across the entire northern hemisphere, blocking sunlight and dropping temperatures by degrees that would have been unimaginable just weeks before. Crops that had survived the initial destruction now froze and died. Growing seasons were eliminated entirely. The global food supply, already shattered by the destruction of major agricultural regions, collapsed further under the darkness and cold. The weeks that followed the exchange were defined by desperation and unlikely resilience. Surviving government officials, operating from deep underground bunkers, attempted to coordinate relief and maintain order. Military units that retained some structure became the backbone of emergency response, distributing remaining supplies and establishing safe corridors between surviving communities. Amateur radio operators became the nervous system of the post-war world, relaying information between isolated groups of survivors when all official communications had failed. The human cost mounted daily as radiation sickness claimed those who had survived the blasts but received lethal doses of contamination. Medical facilities operated with almost nothing, doctors making impossible choices about who could be saved with the limited supplies remaining. Communities organized themselves with remarkable speed, rationing food and water, establishing security, and caring for orphaned children. The thin veneer of civilization proved more resilient than anyone had expected, even as the physical infrastructure of that civilization lay in ruins. After approximately 3 weeks of continued naval and ground engagements in Europe and the Atlantic, both sides reached the same conclusion through different channels. There was nothing left worth fighting over. Through intermediaries in neutral nations, a ceasefire was negotiated and signed. The war that had lasted less than a month had killed more people than all previous wars in human history combined. The signatures on that ceasefire document were shaky, applied by hands that understood the magnitude of what had been lost. Recovery was measured not in months, but in years and decades. The first priority was establishing zones of habitable land where radiation levels permitted human survival. Scientists worked to map contamination patterns, identify safe water sources, and develop techniques for decontaminating soil. Agriculture had to be rebuilt almost from scratch, beginning with greenhouse facilities and carefully monitored test plots of decontaminated earth. The global population, which had been approximately 3 billion before the war, was estimated at roughly 1.8 billion 6 months after the exchange, and continued declining as the long-term effects of radiation, famine, and nuclear winter took their toll. International cooperation emerged from the ashes not as idealism, but as necessity. No single nation had the resources to recover alone. Scientific knowledge about radiation, agriculture, and medicine was shared openly across former enemy lines. American and Soviet scientists worked side by side, their previous loyalties meaningless in the face of species-level survival. The institutions that emerged from this cooperation were fundamentally different from those that had existed before, forged not in diplomatic conference rooms, but in the shared experience of near extinction. The nuclear disarmament that followed was absolute and permanent. Every remaining warhead on the planet was identified, secured, and systematically dismantled under international supervision. The processes and materials for creating nuclear weapons were placed under the most stringent controls ever devised by human governance. The generation that had witnessed the war ensured through law, through treaty, and through the sheer force of collective trauma that no nation would ever again possess the power to repeat what had happened in October of 1962. Cities were rebuilt, but never the same. The new urban centers incorporated the lessons of destruction into their very architecture. Decentralized power systems, underground shelters integrated into public infrastructure, green spaces designed as fire breaks. The ruins of destroyed cities were preserved as permanent memorials, their skeletal structures left standing as testimony. Children grew up visiting these sites, walking through the remains of civilizations that had been erased in seconds, learning viscerally what their textbooks could only describe in numbers. Decades later, the survivors grew old, and their children inherited a world scarred but enduring. The annual remembrance ceremonies drew millions, candles lit in public squares around the globe, a collective meditation on how close humanity had come to erasing itself entirely. The question that haunted every generation was simple and terrible. How did we let it get so close? How did rational leaders, loving parents, brilliant scientists, and ordinary citizens build a system capable of destroying everything they cherished and then nearly use it? The world that emerged from the ashes of 1962 was neither utopia nor dystopia. It was simply human, carrying the weight of an unforgettable lesson. The population slowly recovered. Technology advanced along different paths, with energy, medicine, and agriculture receiving the investment that had once flowed into weapons. The scars on the land healed over decades, forests returning to places that had been wastelands, rivers running clean again through patient remediation. But the scars on human memory were designed to never heal. That was the point. Every memorial, every preserved ruin, every annual ceremony existed to keep the wound open, to ensure that the memory of what nuclear war actually looked like would never fade into abstraction. Because the survivors understood something that the pre-war world had only theorized. Nuclear war has no winners. There is no strategic victory when the battlefield is civilization itself. There is only varying degrees of loss, measured in lives, in cities, in ecosystems, and in the decades of recovery that follow. This scenario never happened. The Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved through diplomacy, courage, and an extraordinary amount of luck. Vasily Arkhipov did refuse to authorize that torpedo launch. Kennedy and Khrushchev did find a way to step back from the brink. But the weapons that existed in 1962 still exist today, in far greater numbers and with far greater destructive power. The lesson of this alternate history is not about the past. It is about every single day that follows, and the choices that determine whether humanity's most terrible capability remains forever unused.